I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the story of Peter Connolly, otherwise known as Baby P or Baby Peter, who died on 3rd of August 2007 at only 16 months old of multiple non-accidental injuries. Everyone will remember different aspects of this story, but one aspect which I suspect features large is that Peter was seen by a doctor only 2 days before he died. The doctor in question was a locum at the Child Development Centre at St Anne's Hospital in Tottenham, who didn't have the necessary paediatric training for her role, who was plainly trying to do a job in extremely difficult circumstances, and who had not been provided with Peter's full background notes or history, and was in some important respects therefore working in the dark. According to the serious case review, Peter had visible bruises and was rather unwell. The doctor decided against examining Peter, apparently not appreciating the seriousness of the case. It also became clear after Peter's death that the 4 consultant paediatricians employed at the CDC had, in the summer of the previous year, 2006, written a letter to the management teams raising serious concerns about missing notes, poor administration, lack of child protection follow-up, and the capacity at the centre, concerns that with hindsight appeared well-founded. As many of you will also know, the whistleblowing story connected to the Peter Connolly story is that of Kim Holt, who was one of the 4 consultants. In 2004, Great Ormond Street had agreed a partnership arrangement with Haringey PCT to establish a community paediatric service in Haringey. Initially, the service functioned perfectly well, but as demands grew and cuts followed in 2006, the consultants grew increasingly worried, and in the summer they wrote their letter. By the autumn, 2 of those consultants had left. The post of the named doctor had been cut, leaving 2 consultants trying to do the work that all 4 had been struggling with. Relationships deteriorated. Dr. Holt was signed off unwell in March 2007 and was then put on so-called special leave, which lasted until Dr. Holt eventually returned to work in the summer of 2011 at the same CDC, which by then had transferred across to the Whittington. During the period of special leave, Great Ormond Street were unwilling to enable Dr. Holt's return to work. They offered her a settlement agreement, including a confidentiality clause, which she didn't sign. They spent over £360,000 on legal and other advisors, and £103,000 on an external law firm investigation commissioned by NHS London. Dr. Holt wasn't actually dismissed. Her employment continued. There was growing media speculation of a cover-up by Great Ormond Street. And if you wish to see more, I would recommend articles by Claire Dyer in the BMJ and Phil Hammond in Private Eye. I came to recognise that Kim Holt's case had many features in common with other NHS cases: a serious underlying concern, bullying, opaque employer practices, an enormous power imbalance between the parties, huge pressure brought to bear on the whistleblower, a substantial waste of public money, or so it appeared, and medical talent, the use of settlement agreements with NDAs, and the absence of alternative processes to solve the problem. The fact that Dr. Holt returned to work in the NHS at all was exceptional, and certainly at the time it was common currency that if you blew the whistle, you'd be blacklisted and you wouldn't return to work. Why did this go on for so long? Why was it allowed to happen, and why wasn't there a better way of dealing with it? My perspective is that of someone external to the health service. I have a city legal background with some recent mediation and research experience, although I should be clear, I'm not an employment law specialist. Kim Holt and I had known one another since the late 1980s, and our families were friendly, and I was glad to support her in a small way at the time, and later on in connection with her work, along with others, supporting NHS whistleblowers through Patients First. I've been fortunate to meet a number of NHS whistleblowers now, and I haven't met any who I've not greatly admired and respected. Many have suffered a great deal, As an outsider, however, I was unversed in the ways of the NHS, and I have to say I was completely taken aback by what happened to Kim Holt after she raised concerns in 2006. Now, moving on a little, in September 2014, I was part of a small pro bono legal team headed by Patrick Green QC, which supported a group of NHS whistleblowers working together as Patients First in preparing an evidence-based submission to the Freedom to Speak Up review carried out by Robert Francis QC, who we heard speak this morning. Our job was to carry out a thematic review of 70 stories provided confidentially and anonymously by NHS whistleblowers. The stories painted an unmistakable picture of great difficulty, and many of them shared the features of Kim Holt's case. They were often factually complex, with many events and actors, including managers, co-workers, investigators, regulators, unions, lawyers. They displayed powerful emotions, perspectives that couldn't be reconciled, opaque practices, conflicts of interest, a lack of independence in handling cases, trauma and suffering, the loss of job and career, family breakdown, and long-term mental health consequences. And these very serious consequences were reflected in the Francis report. But for me, there was also a vacuum, which was the absence of a better process, which had the capacity and sophistication to address the different aspects of these complex disputes. What we realised from looking at the stories was that the patient safety issue, the clinical issue, was sidelined and essentially just fell out of the story, and that the focus became the employment dispute. Now, this was also an important finding of the Francis Review, and they looked at many more cases than we did in our submission. Robert Francis said this: "There is a remarkable consistency in the pattern of reactions described by staff who told of bad experiences. Whistleblowers have provided convincing evidence that they raised serious concerns, which were not only rejected, but were met with a response which focused on disciplinary action against them, rather than any effective attempt to address the issue they raised." That's paragraph 6 on page 8. Francis was careful to acknowledge that cases are not always clear-cut, and parties held different perspectives, but this did not undermine this important finding. So why does it work this way? The Francis report suggested that many factors come into play, including cultural factors, and that defaulting to blame seems less difficult than the alternatives. Francis also identified a marked lack of the skills required to deal with difficult and sensitive situations. Cases could become formalised, legalistic, and entrenched at an early stage, making it even more challenging to find solutions. Now, it's often said that whistleblowers are not protected by the law, so I wanted to offer the briefest outline of whistleblowing law and some of its challenges. Now, this is a super simplistic overview, but I hope it may be useful knowledge. So, what is the law to begin with? Well, it's set out in the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998. It added sections into an existing statute called the Employment Rights Act. What are the remedies and what are they for? Well, the remedies are here on the slide, but the focus tends to be on financial compensation or damages. But the main point really is the legislation provides remedies if you're dismissed for whistleblowing or if you suffer detriment for whistleblowing. So just to highlight four aspects of that. If the whistleblowing was the sole or main reason that you end up being dismissed from your employment, then it is automatically unfair. Detriment applies to a wider group known as workers, which is a wider category including agency workers, junior doctors now, interns, student nurses and midwives. Thirdly, there is no qualifying period of employment. So in theory, if you raise a concern in your first week at work, that could qualify in terms of remedy under the Act. And compensation in both cases for both dismissal and detriment is uncapped, I mention this because dismissal for non-whistleblowing reasons is typically capped, which I think presently is around £86,000. But in circumstances where your entire career could be blighted, uncapped damages is a valuable remedy. But what does it actually mean to blow the whistle? Because in lay terms, it's usually taken to mean that you simply raise a concern at work. But to fall within the technical requirements of the legislation, your disclosures have to amount to what is called qualifying disclosures. And not to overcomplicate it, this essentially means you have to convey information, so a mere unsupported allegation or an opinion about a colleague will not do that. And you have to show that the disclosure that you're making tends to show the wrongdoing or the malpractice, and also that the disclosure is in the public interest. So qualifying disclosures are the basic starting point for blowing the whistle, and if you haven't made qualifying disclosures, then you're not even off first base as far as the legislation is concerned. However, that is only part of the story. The qualifying disclosures then have to be elevated to what are called protected disclosures, and for this to happen, they have to be made to the relevant person in accordance with what is usually known as the three-tier disclosure regime under PIDA. The idea of the legislation is to encourage internal disclosures to your employer as a first step, then disclosures to regulators as a second step, and a wider disclosure, if necessary, to your MP, the police, or the media as a third and final step. But to stay within the legislation and make sure you preserve your remedies as a whistleblower, you have to make sure that you hit the thresholds of each tier of disclosure. Now, for internal disclosures to your employer, that should be straightforward. So long as your disclosures are qualifying disclosures, then if you go to your employer with them first and foremost as your first step, then they ought to be protected. So that should be straightforward. When it comes to regulatory, there is a list of regulators prescribed by statute. In the health context, that list includes the CQC, Health Watch England, the National Guardian's Office, the GMC, Health Education England, Monitor, NHS England, NHS Improvements, and the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. This threshold also requires that you believe that what you're disclosing is within the scope of the relevant body, so you need to be a little careful about that, and that you believe that any allegations you make are substantially true. When it comes to the nuclear option, which is the sort of wider disclosure to the outside world, then the threshold is higher. And there are two aspects. It's more complex, so I just want to highlight a couple of aspects here. The first is that it must not be made for personal gain. So if you're being paid by a newspaper for your story, that will be a problem. There also has to be a sort of gateway, if you will, to the outside world. And that gateway is normally that you have done one of three things. One is that you've already made the disclosure to your employer or the regulator. In other words, you've been through the first two steps. Otherwise, you have to believe that you're going to be victimised, and therefore you haven't taken the earlier steps, or you think there's going to be a cover-up. So those gateways also have to be met for there to be a wider disclosure. So that is the briefest outline, if you will, of what disclosures you need to make, to whom and how, to make sure you fall within the legislation. Of course, it's much more intricate and complex than I've suggested there, so it is important, really, that you recognise the complexity when making disclosures. But the statute, PIDA itself, has challenges, so here are some of them. First of all, and most obviously, the legislation confers individual employment rights, but it doesn't create any obligation to investigate the patient safety issue or the public interest issue. So it is not really a method of holding employers to account for not dealing with the patient safety issue. That is effectively a matter for other regimes which you will understand better than I, NHS investigations, regulation by professional bodies, and so on. Secondly, All of these remedies are after the event. And in this respect, PIDA is similar to other laws. So discrimination under the Equality Act 2010, for example. Law should be a deterrent, but it can't always stop bad things happening in the workplace. It may highlight bullying conduct by a manager towards you, but the focus is going to be on the detriment that you have suffered, not on the culpability, if you will, of the person doing the bullying. The CARC review into fit and proper persons may help in this regard, but we'll see. If you were to go to a full hearing, then your disclosures, whether they are qualified and protected, whether they cause the dismissal or the detriment, that represents a series of significant legal questions which will be heavily scrutinised by the lawyers, and therefore outcomes can be very uncertain. So actions that you may have taken many months ago or longer will come under a legal microscope. You need to be prepared for that. There is a big question of cost of legal action if it comes to that. Research has shown that chances of winning a full employment tribunal hearing are higher if you're legally represented, but of course it can be expensive. Legal aid is not available for whistleblowing claims, as I understand it. Crowdfunding, as Chris Day has shown, may be a possibility, but it won't be possible in all cases. Union help might be available, but again, that may not be straightforward, and that can get very political, as I understand it. Employment tribunals can make awards for costs, particularly where there's been unreasonable or vexatious behaviour, but again, it's complex and time-consuming. Now, PIDA may award you uncapped financial compensation, but I think there is a question as to whether you will ever be compensated fully for the trauma and the stress that you've undergone and for the damage to your NHS career. There have been substantial awards in NHS cases, but the level of damages that will be awarded by the tribunal at the end of the day will be contested. Now, I have a point here about NDAs. I suspect that may be one I can't go into now, so that may be a point for questions, but PIDA does provide that any agreement that seeks to prevent protected disclosures being made will be void. That's section 43J. We know, don't we, that that is not sufficient on its own to prevent their use. And as I say, that may be something we can talk about further over questions. So there are many shortcomings to this statute. There is a good, helpful review published by Thomson Reuters and Blueprint for Free Speech, which I've mentioned on the slide there. So let me try and sort of pull together some remarks to conclude. So from my external legal perspective, I would say to any worker, you have to deal with the law as it stands now, not as it should be or as you want it to be, as it stands now. And it will be prudent, therefore, to have an understanding of the requirements and challenges that presents if you are considering speaking up, particularly about a serious matter. Take advice from helplines. There are good helplines with Protect, formerly Public Concern at Work, or Whistleblowers UK. Read and follow your employer's policy. It's important that you are aware of that. Work with others. Get support where you can get it. Speak to the local guardian. Up your knowledge levels. My personal perspective would always be to try to find a collaborative and negotiated way through all of this that addresses all of your concerns, if at all possible. And I would say take legal advice on the way through so that you know where you stand at each point. However, I completely recognise that collaborative solutions may be hard to find, and that as principled professionals, there will be compromises that may well be unacceptable. My thought here is not at all to be defeatist about the importance of speaking up, but to reality check about legal issues. More than anything, I would suggest that you talk to other whistleblowers. No one knows the meaning of whistleblowing, how it works, or its consequences better than the whistleblowers. On a more positive note, it must surely be the case that awareness of whistleblowing and its complications has increased since the Francis Review. I'm not messianic about mediation, but I do think legal processes matter and they tend to guide outcomes. So I would like to think that other more sophisticated processes could be conceived with the benefit of more research and buy-in from all constituencies. There are models outside healthcare, actually, that suggest this may be possible, where they seek to keep the whistleblower in the workplace, not out of the workplace, and they call upon suitably qualified people with real knowledge and expertise, and which treat whistleblowing as a distinct type of problem with its own more complex aspects, not simply as a question of individual employment rights. Thank you very much.